Welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. Our guest is Samuel Clowes Huneke. Samuel Clowes Huneke is an assistant professor of history at George Mason University. He is a historian of modern Europe with a focus on the social and political history of the 19th and 20th century Germany. He is broadly interested in how everyday life intersects with and shapes the relationships between citizens and states. His research foci include the history of gender and sexuality, legal history, and the history of democracy. He received a B.A. summa cum laude in German and mathematics from Amherst College, and Masters of Science with distinction in applicable mathematics from the London School of Economics, and a Ph.D. in history from Stanford University. His new book, States of Liberation: Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, will be published March 22nd by the University of Toronto Press. And now on to the show.
So I'm Samuel Huneke. I'm a historian of modern Germany. I am an assistant professor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and I live in Washington, D.C. I recently wrote a book called States of Liberation: Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, which looks at gay persecution and liberation across the entire span of the Cold War in both East and West Germany. And I'm broadly interested in queer history, legal history, the history of democracy, and I, again, mostly research Germany in the 20th century.
Yeah, so what is your background with Germany? Because I've only visited very briefly, so I'm not real familiar with it. Tell me about your relationship with Germany, and for people that have never been to Germany, I guess, whatever you could say about that.
Yeah, so I first went to Germany actually when I was 9 years old. My parents were living over there for a few months, and so I went with them. That's when I started learning German. We were in Bonn, which was the capital at the time. It was in the late 90s. It was a really weird, wonderful experience. When we moved back to the States after that, I kept learning German. And sort of around that time when I was younger, I also became really fascinated with history in general. And so those two interests sort of merged over the course of my education. I went to Amherst College for my bachelor's degree, and I studied German and history while I was there. I was a German major, and I actually wrote my BA thesis on the author Klaus Mann, who was the son of Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize laureate. And then I wound up going to Stanford to get a PhD in history. And I specialized in modern European history while I was there, modern Germany within that. And sort of over the course of my 6 years there, I read a lot more in queer history specifically, and became a lot more sort of interested in the history of sexuality, generally speaking. Across the course of my education, I've lived in Germany a couple other times. I lived in Heidelberg when I was an undergrad, which is this beautiful university town in southwest Germany. There's a major American military base there. And then I've also lived in Berlin. That's where I did a lot of the research for my book that just came out. It's a wonderful country. It's obviously very different in a lot of ways from the US. Berlin in particular, you can still feel the scars from the Second World War in a lot of ways, and from the Cold War. So anyway, I'm happy to talk more about sort of the experience of living in Germany, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I was only there very briefly. I thought it was a lovely country. Everyone there, it almost seems like just because it's a Germanic language, English isn't that different. And I feel like I could almost speak German just by guessing sometimes. I mean, I don't mean to be too presumptuous, because obviously if somebody tried to speak German to me right now, I couldn't exactly, you know what I mean? But like, I remember there was like a box of just glasses, like water glasses. And on the outside it said water glass. And then I'm like, oh, come on, I can guess that.
Yeah, no, it has a lot of similarities. Honestly, the thing that really trips people up is the grammar. It has a much more it has a very strange grammatical structure to an English speaker.
Right.
But yeah, lots of similar words like, yeah, water is Wasser, so very similar.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah. But yeah, it's really fascinating the book, what you cover in this book, and I wanted to start kind of at the beginning though with pre-war, or at least pre-World War II, I guess, Germany. That was a very different place, obviously, from what it became. But tell us a little bit about the origins and kind of where you start the story of this.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I before World War One, Germany was in many ways seen as a sort of leader in culture and higher education. And this continued after World War One. The Weimar period of the 1920s was this sort of efflorescence of culture. It was really a remarkable place to be. This is when you have some of the most iconic early films. You have actresses like Marlene Dietrich and Lotte Lenya. You have artists like Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill. You have novelists. You have sort of the origins of expressionism. You have new artistic forms. You have the Bauhaus. And part of this sort of ferment, this cultural ferment, was the first homosexual rights movement in modern history. And this really got its start in the late 19th century. One of the most significant figures in this movement was Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a doctor from northern Germany, and he became involved in campaigning against the sodomy law in Imperial Germany in the late 19th century. And he also became very interested in researching sexual identities and sexual behaviors. And so, thanks to him and a lot of other of his contemporaries, many other activists from this era, the first sort of thing that we might think of as a gay rights movement coalesced in the 1920s. And that was completely wiped out by the Nazis when they took power in 1933. Most of the Nazis were incredibly opposed to queerness of any shape or form. They were particularly hostile. They were hostile to both gay men and lesbians. Around 10,000 gay men were sent to concentration camps where they wore the now infamous symbol of the pink triangle, which then in later years and later decades became a symbol of gay liberation. Lesbian women were also persecuted in a variety of ways. So you have this incredible change, a sort of, almost a small golden age, followed by just catastrophe for Germany's queer populations in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, right. And there's so much that you said there that, of course, I want to ask you about. Yeah, but talk a little bit about. Let's get into, because I was not really aware of this paragraph or section 175 and subsection A, and get into the weeds a little bit, because I do think that is a important part. And I just have to say, I'm astounded. I know this has to be true for other laws too, but I'm astounded that Nazi era laws are allowed to stand in non-Nazi Germany. It's just, it's unthinkable. Like, it's like, this is illegitimate. Like, we've already said that this is not, the way it's going to be. And maybe if this is, you still want to say that, make a new law, you know what I mean? But like, it's like, they're still like, no, it looks good. Like,
yeah, no, it's wild. And there's still some of these remnants. The German parliament was actually just recently debating ending or repealing a Nazi era law that dictated abortion service.
Wow.
So things like that. The treaty that governs relations between the Vatican and Germany was a treaty negotiated by the Nazis, and it's still in force. So you have all these weird lingering remnants. And one of them, as you point out, is paragraph 175. It's a paragraph of the German criminal code. And it first comes into being when Germany first becomes a state in 1871 at the end of the 19th century. And at the time only bans penetrative sex between men. And as a result of that, it's actually quite hard to win convictions in court, because the prosecutor sort of has to get into all this mucky detail to actually prove that penetration occurred. And if the various parties say, no, it didn't, it's very hard to prove that it did. That changes under the Nazis. In 1935, they passed this new version of paragraph 175 that makes any conduct that can be construed as homosexual in nature illegal. And on top of that, they add this other law called paragraph 175, subsection A, that creates all these classes of sort of qualified homosexuality. So one of them has to do with the so-called seduction of youth. So this notion that gay men seduce young sort of men, teenagers, into being homosexual. And this law was meant to sort of put a particularly harsh penalty on that. It also puts a particularly harsh penalty on male prostitution. So they create these two laws that really ramp up both the number of acts that are criminalized and also the types of penalties that can be meted out to people convicted under these laws. And as a result of that, you go from having fewer than 1,000 convictions per year under the law to around 50,000 convictions over 12 years. So it's a huge wave of persecution, especially in the mid to late 1930s. And as you say, when the post-war era rolls around, the Allied powers are left with these laws, and they're left sort of deciding, well, what do we do with them? And it wasn't at all clear, what they would decide. And so in East Germany, actually, the communist government decided to ditch the Nazi era law and go back to the previous version of the law. And they did that because they had long had they'd at least paid lip service to the notion of repealing this law. And so there were sort of progressive voices within that government that wanted to do away with it. In West Germany, on the other hand, they kept the law for another 20 years. So from 1949 to 1969, West Germany was still prosecuting queer men under this law that the Nazis had created. And between 1949 and 1969, you have over 50,000 men who are convicted in West Germany.
Yes. Again, so much I want to talk about with what you just said, but to go back just a little bit again.
Yeah.
I want to talk about, because this is it's a reoccurring theme that I think is worth exploring in your book here. So you have, let's talk about the Night of the Long Knives. So it's a very important part of this whole mentality, because the fear seems to be that these gay men are going to get together in these clubs and they're going to secretly wield power, which on the one hand, when I read that, I'm like, of course, when you ostracize a group from society and say you can't be open about who you are, of course they're going to form secret clubs. Right. I mean, what else do you expect people to do? People are going to life finds a way, as they say. So yeah, of course that would be happening, but it's also interesting vis-a-vis what you spoke about or wrote about also with the lesbians versus gays, in that they didn't seem quite as concerned about lesbians for a whole host of reasons. But anyway, that's a lot to get into, but just wherever you want to start with that.
Yeah, no. So for folks who maybe haven't heard of the Night of Long Knives before, this takes place in the summer of 1934, a little over a year after Hitler comes to power. And basically, it is a huge purge of various internal enemies. And so the primary target is Ernst Röhm, who is the head of the Nazi paramilitary organization, the Stormtroopers. These, also known as the SA, these are the people who wear brown shirts. It's why brown is the color associated with Nazism. And essentially, they were the most sort of radical, also the most sort of working class wing of the party. And they, after the Nazis took power, increasingly became sort of an embarrassment to the party leadership. And there were various components to this. In some areas around economic policy, they really wanted a much more radical policy. The Stormtroopers were a massive organization, millions of members, and the German military felt threatened by this massive paramilitary force. And so for all of these reasons, Hitler eventually decides to do away with Röhm and the other leadership of the SA. And so he has them executed. There are various other politicians who get sort of swept up in this purge. But after the fact, Hitler sort of invents this reason for it by saying that Röhm, who was a gay man, it was a fairly well-known fact that he was a gay man. And in fact, there had been a scandal in the last years of the Weimar Republic around his homosexuality. But Hitler then goes to, the leadership. He goes to the parliament, which at this point only has Nazi members in it, and essentially says Röhm was gathering this clique of gay conspirators around him, and they were planning to launch a coup against me and against the Nazi leadership. So that's where you get this myth that sort of propagates in the Nazi era, that gay men not only are going out and seducing youth into a homosexual lifestyle, but they also have a political agenda behind that, right? They want to create these conspiracies and these cliques, these secret groups, and use that to destabilize the government, destabilize society. And of course, it does seem sort of ridiculous to us now, or sort of ludicrous, but this was deadly serious at the time. Even though it starts as this sort of excuse for a purge, it takes on a life of its own. And it really carries on down past the Nazi era. It's something that I found characterized how West Germans, how the West German government, West German politicians talked about homosexuality and about gay men. And one other thing that you mentioned is the sort of side of lesbians. In the Nazi era, women were largely excluded from public life. Nazi ideology saw women primarily as mothers and as wives. And so they, weren't supposed to have leadership positions. They weren't supposed to have jobs. They weren't, supposed to have a public profile. And because of that, they didn't believe that lesbians could or would pose the same threat to public safety or political stability that they feared gay men might. However, that said, there is the caveat that I've done a fair amount of research on lesbian women in the Nazi period. And one thing I found is that when you have women who did have jobs, did have careers, did have some sort of public facing profile, the same language can creep into how Nazis think about them, especially if they're denounced or wind up in some sort of police proceeding or trial. Oftentimes, these fears around seduction and around clique building do actually start cropping up for lesbian women who have that sort of a public profile.
Talk about the differences between East Germany and West Germany, and it is interesting because we have one behind the Iron Curtain, if you will, and then the other in the free world, quote unquote. But it's kind of interesting to compare the two with each other. What differences can you kind of illustrate for us? And similarities, I guess, too. But
yeah, that's really sort of the question at the heart of the book and at the heart of my research. So basically, when I went into this research project, when I first went to Berlin and started looking at archives, I really had that sort of Cold War stereotype in mind, right? The free West and the sort of repressed authoritarian East. And what I really found quite quickly was that in a lot of ways didn't really hold up. And so in the early Cold War period in the 1950s and 1960s, as I've already mentioned, you have West Germany, which keeps this Nazi era law and uses it to convict over 50,000 men. In the East, they revert to this much more lenient law from the 1920s. And then in the late 1950s, they more or less stop using it to prosecute consensual sexual acts between adult men. And so as a result of that, we don't have complete statistics for East Germany, but the per capita conviction rate in East Germany was much, much lower than it was in West Germany. And so that was one area where it just immediately doesn't sort of fit this narrative of there being greater repression in East Germany. Now, that doesn't mean that everything was sort of wonderful and tolerant and so forth. In East Germany, you still have a lot of social stigma. You do still have persecution of gay men who occupy positions of privilege. So party members, people who are in the army or the secret police, if they're discovered to be gay, will usually be fired or thrown out of the party. So you do still have elements of persecution and elements of intolerance in both societies. And so actually, when I drilled down and was looking for evidence of what daily life looked like for queer people in both Germanys, in the 1950s and 1960s, it actually looks pretty similar. You actually have, men are largely forced to go cruising in public places to look for sex or to look for partners. So they're going to public baths, they're going to forests, they're going to train stations, they're going to public toilets, and so on and so forth. And so that's taking place on both sides of the wall. You do have some bars that are known to cater to queer clientele, but they have to deal with frequent raids from the police. So you do have these two very different legal apparatuses and sort of regimes in the two Germanys, but in terms of daily life, there actually is a lot of similarity between the two.
Yeah. Going back to the legal aspect, though, they did consider underage to be what, age 22 and under? Like, that was a little bit surprising to read. Where was that? And I feel like the recruiting aspect, they're definitely trying to instill fears, like they're trying to recruit, because it's like if you can turn someone gay, quote unquote, of course you're trying to recruit them, but it's like,
Yeah. No, no. So you have those fears about like recruiting people into being gay. Those exist on both sides of the border.
And in the rest of the world too. This is not restricted to Germany. And that's another thing I wanted to get into is like, how does the legal and social attitudes and apparatus in Germany compare with the rest of the world, as the 60s are going on and things are going on elsewhere other than Germany too?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That was something that I really wanted, or I was thinking about a lot when I was doing this research and writing this book. So what's happening in West Germany in particular is not that dissimilar from what's going on in other Western countries. In the 1950s, you have a sort of wave of homophobia. And so in the US, this takes the form of the Lavender Scare, where, Senator McCarthy not only was going after communists, but was also going after gay men and lesbians who worked in the federal government. And you have this long going purge of queer federal employees, and that's known as the Lavender Scare. In various countries that had decriminalized homosexuality, there are efforts to recriminalize it. There's in places like France that didn't criminalize homosexuality. There are new laws against things like solicitation that are used to harass queer people. In the UK, you actually have a very similar law to the Nazi one that also bans most sort of sexual acts between men, even if there isn't penetration. There too, you have a ramp up in prosecutions under that law after World War II. So you do have this general wave of increased persecution after World War II. And West Germany is very much in line with that. I think what sort of makes it a bit different is this Nazi context, that not only is it sort of going along with the pack in terms of what Western nations are doing, but it is still using a Nazi-era law. It's still using Nazi-era language to justify what it's doing and to describe what it's doing. And so this is a further piece of evidence that Germany, West Germany, didn't really fully denazify, certainly not in the 1950s and not for quite some time after World War II. And in East Germany, you have a much more muddled picture, as I hope I'm getting across, that you have some legal reform. You have, in a lot of ways, things looking better for queer people. At the same time, you do have elements of persecution. You have elements of stigma. And so it doesn't quite look like any other case. The USSR, for instance, had recriminalized homosexuality under Stalin in the 1930s. And we don't have precise figures there, but estimates are that thousands of gay men went to the gulags. And interestingly, after Stalin died, you don't really see much of a let up in that persecution, that gay men continue to be persecuted and stigmatized in the Soviet Union. So it's interesting that in a lot of ways, East Germany breaks with the Soviet Union when it comes to regulating sexuality.
Yeah, and you describe it as being not out as like people are able to like kind of live, but it's not as out in the open maybe as West Germany, but
Yeah.
also yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially by like the end of the 1960s, you have this situation where, in a lot of ways, legally the situation is better in East Germany, but because West Germany is this consumerist, capitalist place, you have a better subculture, a better commercial subculture for queer people. You have more bars. Once adult homosexuality is decriminalized in 1969 in West Germany, you have sex clubs and magazines, and you just have a lot more opportunities. And so that's a sort of duality that I found kept cropping up, was that in some ways, when it came to policy, East Germany might look better, but then in other ways, when it came to sort of commercial experiences or culture, West Germany might look better. And so that's actually where I got the idea for the title of the book, States of Liberation, that you can't really describe gay liberation as just one thing or one project. It's something that takes place on all these different planes. It happens in idiosyncratic and inconsistent ways. And so by the end of the 1980s, you have sort of two things that look like liberation in East and West Germany, but they look very different from each other.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of these public places, like the gay bars, are kind of like magnets for getting busted. So
Yeah.
it's like this understanding that these places get to exist, but I don't know, if I was a gay man in West Germany, I wouldn't necessarily want to go
Right,
there.
right.
You know, it's like
It's true.
it seems too good to be true. It's like, okay, I can go in here and nope.
Yeah. No, and that's completely true. They're absolutely magnets. And in fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, when this is still illegal,
Mhm.
there are records of police essentially saying we actually should allow some of these bars to exist because they're convenient for keeping an eye on these people. It's a convenient place to raid and sort of round them up. So no, I mean, there's definitely a sort of sinister side to it, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. And the raids, though, even after homosexuality is decriminalized. So once we get to the 1970s and you start having this more robust commercial subculture, you have new radical gay liberation groups, you still have raids on bars. I mean, this was a quite shocking thing to me, was just the frequency with which police continued to raid these bars in West Germany. And that, they might say, oh, we're checking for prostitutes or we're looking for underage people. But it certainly made life harder for queer people in West Germany.
Yeah, definitely. But how do things progress as the years go on here?
Yeah.
Past the 60s, like we're moving towards the end of the Cold War. What's going on there? I mean,
yeah, no, it's again a sort of surprising set of developments. I mean, probably what will sound most familiar to American viewers is what happens in West Germany in the 70s. So in the US, of course, we have the Stonewall riots in 1969, and this leads to a new generation of gay liberation activists. And this is sort of what we associate with or as sort of the origins of today's gay and lesbian rights movement. And so in West Germany, you have paragraph 175 is reformed in 1969. And a couple of years later, this director named Rosa von Braunheim releases a film called It Is Not the Homosexual Who Is Perverse, but Rather the Situation in Which He Lives, which is a mouthful. And it's sort of a campy, judgy movie. It's about the gay subculture, and it sort of it has a very strong political message, basically, that gay men need to stop being so obsessed with sex and obsessed with going to bars and so forth to look for sex, and rather forge political solidarity with one another. And this film, it's a huge I don't know if hit's the right word, but it sparks a huge national conversation, and it leads to all these gay rights groups, all these gay liberation groups getting founded across West Germany. And they spend the 1970s fighting for greater visibility, for various political and policy outcomes, like getting rid of employment blacklists for queer people, getting reparations for victims of Nazism. At the time, paragraph 175 was still on the books, and it set a higher age of consent. So for most of the 1970s, gay men had an age of consent of 18, which was considerably higher than for straight people. So this is what they're fighting for, and they actually get a lot of traction and a lot of visibility over the 1970s. But by the end of the decade, they have this they sort of have a period of decline, and they see themselves as more of being a failure. They fail to actually enact any change at the federal level, at the national level in terms of policy. And so the 1980s, so the 1970s are quite similar in a lot of ways to what's going on in the US or in other Western countries. But by the 1980s, you have a movement that's in some ways much more timid politically and has reoriented itself to sort of social and cultural activism. But what's really interesting about the 1980s is, of course, that Germany, West Germany, like the US, is confronted with the AIDS crisis. And in the US, infamously, Reagan refused to even say the word AIDS for years after it had become a crisis here. In West Germany, sort of shockingly, the center-right government, the Christian Democratic Union, is in power, and their government actually pursues a very pragmatic course of action to try and confront the disease and stop it in its tracks. And they're actually quite successful. They work with these gay and lesbian activists to spread awareness about the disease, awareness about safer sex, and so on. And they do succeed over the course of the decade in really bringing down infection rates. The sort of perverse outcome of that is that in the US, you have, as a result of the government's inaction, a newly sort of politicized movement. You think of groups like ACT UP New York that spearhead or sort of create all these new forms of direct action and engagement with the government, and it creates a new sense of urgency for gay and lesbian rights. And you don't really have that in West Germany because the government is actually so responsive to the needs of its queer citizens. So you have this very sort of ambivalent or ambiguous 1980s where you don't have a robust political movement, but you have a lot of gain on medical issues, on cultural issues, on social issues. And what I found then is that in East Germany, things are basically the opposite. You have gay liberation activists that start organizing in East Berlin in the 1970s, and they're confronted with the East German secret police, or the Stasi, which was the largest secret police force per capita in world history. It's an absolutely massive police force. Estimates are that around 5% of the East German population worked for the Stasi at some point or another. And so they're confronted by this paranoid surveillance state that immediately sees what they're trying to do as oppositional in nature. So these early activists in East Germany in the 1970s, they're just trying to get a place to sort of hang out, to congregate with other queer people. And the state, the Stasi, immediately sort of interprets this as threatening to the regime. And so there's this antagonism between the two in the 1970s, and ultimately the secret police shuts the group down. But at the end of the 70s, you have this activism that looks like it has sort of failed in East Germany, whereas it's had a lot of successes in West Germany in sort of changing the culture and society. It sort of that dynamic sort of reverses in the 1980s. In East Germany, these activists start organizing under the umbrella of the Protestant Church, which might sound surprising, especially to us in the US, where were sort of used to thinking of queerness and religion as diametrically opposed to each other. Now, of course, that's not actually the case. It's never been the case. And in East Germany, the Protestant church was the only sort of nominally independent organization in the entire country. Again, it's this communist dictatorship. It's as a socialist state, it's very much opposed to organized religion, but because the church was such a massive presence in East German society and East German life, they couldn't just get rid of it. They couldn't just abolish it. And so over the course of East Germany's existence, they really try and sort of chip away at the church's influence. But even by the 1980s, it's still a very prominent element of East German society. Angela Merkel, for instance, who the former chancellor, who grew up in East Germany, she was a pastor's daughter. Anyway, so the Protestant church is nominally independent, and this enables these sort of groups like these gay and lesbian activists to actually organize under its umbrella. And you have other political movements like peace movement, environmentalist movements that also organize under the Protestant church's umbrella. And so over the course of the 1980s, this movement sort of picks up steam. New groups organize themselves in various East German cities. And this really terrifies the regime. It terrifies the Stasi. And so by the end of the decade, or not by the end of the decade, by the middle of the decade, they realize that their sort of strategy of just trying to repress these groups isn't working, and that they need a new strategy. They need a new tactic. And so what they decide to do is essentially give in to these groups' demands. They figure, well, if we enact all these policies that they're asking for, these groups won't have any cause to exist, and they'll sort of just simply dissolve. And so what you have between about 1985 and 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls, is this slew of pro-gay policymaking in East Germany. You have equalization of the age of consent. You have a new directive to allow queer people to serve in the army. You have the regime relaxing censorship around issues of homosexuality. They make an effort to work with these activist groups to fight AIDS and HIV in East Germany, and the list sort of goes on and on. It's quite a remarkable sort of 180 that the regime does in these years. And so by the end of the decade, whereas you have this sort of somewhat marginalized and dejected gay and lesbian movement in West Germany, you have this incredibly energized and effective movement in East Germany under this communist dictatorship. So again, to me, when I found all of this evidence in the archives, it was completely counterintuitive and not at all what I had expected, going in with a sense of East Germany as a sort of repressive Cold War communist dictatorship.
Well, just going back a little bit, talk a little bit about the research you did for this, because you seem like you went pretty deep into the archives of arrest records and kind of the nitty gritty of it. Talk a little bit about, because I mean, some of these things, it's like you don't know how some of these things ended, and like it's just like the record cuts off.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, so I went to 10 different archives for this research, and then I also interviewed more than 20 people who had lived through the Cold War era. And so I, probably the biggest archive, or the most important archive for me were the archives of the Stasi, of the East German secret police. And I got really lucky in going there. When I first started doing research for this project there, I had told the archivists what I was working on, and they just plopped down a binder with several hundred sheets in it. And these sheets just contained a list of all of the different files that were tagged with homosexuality in the Stasi archives, kilometers worth of files. And they just said, put a check mark next to everyone that you want to look at. And so I spent the better part of a year just going through all these files, surveillance documents, memoranda, and it gave me this incredible insight both into how the East German regime was thinking about homosexuality, and because these are essentially surveillance records of everyday life. It gave me a really rich look into how queer people were actually living in East Germany across the Cold War period. I also went to various police archives and regional art and in various cities around East Germany, or excuse me, well, East Germany and West Germany. And these also offer really rich and detailed information about everyday life, about queer everyday life. The sort of caveat there is that these records, these police records, only exist when someone was arrested or picked up by the police. And so it does give you a somewhat biased view into what this life was like. There's also a really wonderful gay archive in Berlin that had a lot of records of these activist organizations. And then probably the richest and most fascinating sources were the interviews that I carried out with individuals who had lived through this period. I got to speak with former activists in both East and West Germany. I spoke to ordinary people who hadn't been active in the movement but had suffered persecution in the 50s or 60s. And one of the most remarkable interviews was with the former prime minister of East Germany, the only freely elected prime minister. He was not a gay man himself, but he had friends who were, and as a lawyer was sort of on hand to offer legal advice to East German activists. And so he had incredible sort of commentary on the movement and daily life, and then also how the successes of the gay and lesbian movement in East Germany had carried on into Germany after reunification, after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Mm-hmm. But what do you see as the future of this movement in Germany? Is Germany going to be, I mean, it seems like Germany's kind of a leader now, as you know, it to me, it seemed very open when I was there 10 years ago or so, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think right now it is in many ways a leader. It's especially its larger cities are incredibly tolerant places for queer people. It has made efforts, to improve care now for trans people, to make it easier for people to transition. So yeah, in a lot of ways, it's a leader. I mean, there are these sort of curious moments still. So for instance, when I was living in Berlin, Germany actually legalized marriage equality. And it was sort of a strange thing that it hadn't already done it. There was huge public support, but because Angela Merkel's party was in power in those years, the Christian Democratic Union, and they were largely opposed to marriage equality. It simply hadn't happened. And in fact, Angela Merkel, who, in many ways has a sort of excellent reputation among Americans and is seen as, I think at various points she had been called the leader of the free world. She actually voted against the bill to enact marriage equality. So no, in a lot of ways it is a leader, but you still have, I think, some of these resonances of skepticism or stigma. You certainly don't have anything I would think of as persecution at the moment. And I don't see that necessarily changing anytime in the near future. That said, though, I think anyone who studies queer history can see how quickly these things can turn, especially if you look at how queer people were living in Germany in the 1920s and how quickly that changed when the Nazis came to power in 1933. So I guess I'm optimistic, but that optimism is always tempered by how I understand the history.
Sure. Well, that always happens when you study history, right?
Yes, exactly.
It can always get worse.
It certainly can always get worse.
Well, yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, what year was that happened in Germany, that it became legal marriage?
In 2017.
2017.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was only a couple of years. What was it, 2014 with
Yeah.
America?
No, it wasn't that long.
Wasn't that long. And
No.
I remember Hillary and Barack at various times were against it.
Yep.
both came around. So yeah, it was very fast. It was amazing. I remember I was working at a newspaper and I did stories about these, gay and lesbian couples want to get married and they can't, and it's affecting their lives. And it was like a human interest story. And it's like now I can't even imagine like doing a story like that. It seems like ancient history, but I did that not that long ago.
Right. No, I mean, I was in school when all of this
Yeah.
was happening. No, it really wasn't that long ago. And,
Mhm.
it's very, I think, hopeful. I think I mean, one nice thing about this history is that it does give you a lot of cause for optimism and for hope. But I think there's always sort of that nagging voice in the back of your head saying, well, things could always get worse
Oh
again.
yeah, definitely. Well, but it seemed like it was just being held up for so long, and then it all kind of came tumbling down very quickly. And then it was
Yeah.
like it was no big deal. Nobody even I can't even imagine the last time someone that was opposed to it even then brings it up now. It never comes up, since it's
No.
happened. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
No, it doesn't. Although you then have, in the US, you have, I think, efforts to not necessarily attack marriage equality, but
Oh,
to
they
go
might.
back to, I mean, they might, but I think, they think it's easier to attack. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of this law that is working its way through the Florida legislature right now,
Mhm.
that would, essentially make it illegal or very difficult for teachers to talk about anything to do with sexuality or queerness.
Right.
And, that picks up on these same tropes that you see in Germany in the Nazi period and in West Germany and East Germany about sort of seduction and about, this sort of stereotype that queer people are all somehow predators, which is, of
Mhm.
course, is nothing more than sort of homophobia, but it somehow is this homophobic myth that refuses to die.
Mhm. Well, it's just an easy way to smear people and
Yeah.
discredit them. And, it's always, like you said, it's been a trope since time immemorial. It's like people
Yep.
trying to fuse the two together. But yeah,
Yeah.
but it goes back to the idea that you could recruit somebody's a perfectly straight person, and then it's like, oh my gosh, I came into contact with what's going on? Like,
Yep. Yep.
wait a minute. It's that's
Ex-
the idea, and maybe they believe their own propaganda on that issue. You know what I mean? They actually think it could happen, but like, yeah, it's like it's all predicated on that idea, and it's
yeah.
obviously ridiculous, but uh yeah. So
No, that's exactly what it is.
yeah.
And um, anyway, so I do look at things that are happening here, or in places like Russia,
Mm,
and think, well, it's happening there, or it's
sure.
happening here, right? And it could happen anywhere.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely. Well, on that cheery note,
You're right.
well, thank you again for taking all this time this evening. I really do appreciate it. It's a very interesting book. I'm right in the middle of it, so yeah, I'm very interested to finish it out. But one last question I do ask
Mhm.
before we go: what music have you been listening to lately?
Oh, that's a good question. I listen to a lot of more classical music, and so I've been listening to Philip Glass's opera Akhenaten,
Hmm.
about the pharaoh who was the husband of Nefertiti.
Hmm.
So it's for any one of your listeners who likes opera, I highly recommend it.
Interesting. Yeah, no, my son has been studying Egypt, ancient Egypt. So yeah, we've been learning all about Nefertiti, and they
hmm
never found her tomb, I don't believe. There's a thing about her.
That may be right. I actually have a colleague who is an expert on Nefertiti, so I
Wow.
have to
Yeah.
ask her next time I see her.
Well, and then there's Nefertari too, but that's different.
Ah,
But then there's also that bust, that famous bust of Nefertiti. I think that's
yes, which
Nefertiti,
is,
right?
yeah, and it actually is in Berlin. It's one
Mm.
of my favorite museums to go to when I'm there.
What is the museum?
It's called the new museum. So you have
Okay.
and it isn't actually that new. it was built in the 19th century, but there was the
okay.
old museum and then the new museum.
Gotcha.
So yeah, but it contains one of the collections of ancient art and Egyptian art there.
Yeah, I went to the German National Museum in Nuremberg.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that was interesting because they had old timey, like, 5th century, like, bear gods and like the animal like worship, and they had some amazing armor there. It was pretty cool too. But yeah, I'd love to go back to Germany. It was really cool.
It's an amazing country. If you get a chance, you should go see the bust of Nefertiti.
Well, that sounds awesome. Well, great. Well, hey, everyone should check out your book. I've been finding it very interesting, like I said, and I'd love to have you back anytime. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So cool. Well, have a good night. I appreciate it.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Join the Rob Burgess Show mailing list. Go to tinyletter.com/The Rob Burgess Show and type in your email address. Then respond to the automatic message. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review everywhere the podcast is available, including iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, RSS, and now Spotify. The official website for the podcast is www.therobburgessshow.com. You can find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. If you have something to say, record a voice memo on your smartphone and send it to therobburgessshow@gmail.com. Include voice memo in the subject line of the email. Also, if you want to call or text the show for any reason, the number is 317-674-3547. Until next time.